Professor Markus, could you please state your name for the record?
Andrew Markus.
And you have prepared an expert report for the purposes of the Commission dated 6 May 2026, correct?
That is correct.
You have a copy of that report there in front of you?
I do.
I understand there is a correction you would like to make to paragraph 68 of the report, is that right?
That is correct.
What is that correction?
At the bottom of 68, where it says don't know was not an option. So that has to be crossed out.
So we strike out the words "and don't know." With that correction made, is the report otherwise still true and correct to the
I think
best of your
table
knowledge?
8.3.
Table 8.3.
I think don't know and prefer not to say are in the wrong way around.
So that's on page 21, and we should reverse the order.
Yes.
So are we reversing the rows in their entirety, or just the words don't know and prefer not to say? As in, should the numbers stay where they are,
No,
but we're just switching the name?
The numbers have to be, so 11 to 35
Yes,
is don't know,
understand.
and 041 is prefer not to say.
I understand. With those corrections made, is the report otherwise true and correct?
Yes.
I tender that report, which is stat 8999.0055.0012.
Yes, the report will be Exhibit 1.112.
And there's an annexure, stat.899.0057.0019. I tender that.
Exhibit 1.113.
The next annexure is stat.899.0057.0020. I tender that.
That will be Exhibit 1.114.
And the final annexure, stat.899.0057.0021. I tender that.
Yes, Exhibit 1.115.
Professor, you are an Emeritus Professor of Jewish Civilization at Monash University, correct?
Yes.
And you're also a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences of Australia, correct?
Yes.
And you have experience in large-scale public opinion and social survey research, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
You have previously conducted the Scanlon Foundation Mapping Social Cohesion series between 2009 and 2021, correct?
Starting in 2007.
From 2007 to 2021, is that
Correct.
right? But others took over that survey from 2022 onwards.
Yes, I'm still involved. There's a sort of advisory group, and I'm still involved in the advisory group.
All right, but no longer an author of the report.
No longer.
You've also previously led 2 national surveys of attitudes within the Jewish community, the first known as Gen 08, and that was in 2007 to 2008, correct?
Correct.
And the second was known as Gen 17, conducted in 2017.
Correct.
And you've also conducted surveys of Australian attitudes towards the Jewish community, correct?
That is correct.
The first being Crossroads 21,
Yes.
and of course last year Crossroads 25.
Yes.
In your report, you commence by referring to the Scanlon Foundation surveys from about paragraph 28. And you note that that survey tracked attitudes to Jewish Australians as well as other faith groups, including Buddhists, Christians, Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And you note that in that survey, a question was asked, is your personal attitude positive, negative or neutral towards the relevant faith group, correct?
That is correct.
And you note several findings from that survey. The first being that a relatively small proportion of respondents, that is 15% in 2025, indicated they are negative towards people of Jewish faith, correct?
That is correct.
And the second point you make is that that was marginally lower than the proportion indicating a negative attitude towards other faith groups, with the exception of Hindus, which had 14%, correct? And Buddhists at 4%. Is that right?
Yes, and one group was higher.
That being the Muslim group, which was at 35%, correct?
Yes.
And the third point you note is that the proportion of respondents to this question expressing a negative attitude towards people of Jewish faith increased since 2023 from 9% to 15%, correct?
Yes. I think that's very important context, because if you just had that finding on its own, you would have a different understanding than if you understood that there was a general movement for most faith groups.
And so that movement was reflected across other faith groups as well?
Yes, and that shows that if you only have something in isolation, you may misinterpret what is happening.
The fourth point you note as far as that Scanlon Foundation survey is concerned is that an examination of the full response range shows a higher proportion of neutral and a small proportion of don't know responses in relation to attitudes towards people of the Jewish faith. Do you consider those non-committal responses significant?
I think the data is uneven because there is a table 1, which shows that there is some variation for faith groups from 44% to 59%, and possibly not a simple and clear explanation of that. I think the main point there is to understand that the way that when people are asked about faith groups, a lot of people will say, well, I don't have a view on that. I'm neutral. It's the old Australian saying, you know, it's not my business.
Now, you yourself did not conduct that particular survey. That was the one from 2025, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
But you considered it relevant as providing context for explaining the Crossroads 25 findings, is that right?
Yes. You see, these surveys are the best, almost, that are conducted in Australia. There are some government surveys that have very large samples, like 30,000, but there's very few of them. And in the private sector, there's very few surveys using a probability sample with such a large respondents. It's 8,000 plus in 2025. So I think that's particularly interesting because it is as good an indication as we can have of attitudes to Jewish Australians, albeit that it is in the context of faith groups.
And we'll come to the findings from the Crossroads 25 survey in a moment, but do you consider that what emerges from that Scanlon Foundation 2025 survey is consistent with the results of the Crossroads 25 survey?
I believe it is consistent, and you're getting a lot of indications of negativity in the 15 to 20% range with a lot of these questions. So in many of the Scanlon, many of the Crossroads 25 questions, there are 12 items, and 11 of those items would be within that range or lower. So I do think that is an important cross-validation, particularly in the context that there are some other surveys discussed in this report which would indicate a high level of negativity. So that, I think, is why it's an important benchmark.
I understand. And as I say, we'll come to the particular results of Crossroads 25 in a moment. But just to understand the purpose of that survey and the methodology you adopted, this was a survey you conducted between 5 and 25 August in last year, is that right?
Correct, yes.
And you say it was commissioned by the Jewish Independent?
Yes.
Did they have any control over the design and conduct of the survey?
Not at all. It was a total independence on my part.
Right.
It's the third survey I've done, I think, for them, and I have total freedom of how to design that.
And do you describe the Crossroads 25 survey as an attitudinal survey? Does that simply mean that it's a survey that seeks to ascertain attitudes, and in this case, attitudes towards the Jewish community?
That is correct, yes.
And you express your aim in this report of that Crossroads 25 survey as being to understand whether increased anti-Semitic incidents reflected a shift in public opinion towards Jewish Australians. Is that the aim?
That is correct.
Could you just describe for us why attitudinal surveys are useful, and also what their limitations might be compared to other forms of research?
That's a big question. I think they are useful because when you have people talking about, say, lived experience, which is of course fundamental importance to listen to people, but they would not necessarily have an overview. They might say, look, I go to university every day and this is what I see every day. That's a reflection on the broader environment, yes. But often they're very personal. And so not to say one approach is any better than the other, but they are complementary. And here they are complementary because they give you an understanding of the lie of the land. And this is essentially what this survey is about, and what the Commission may or may not find useful is having that perspective of roughly what is the distribution of attitudes.
And the limitations of a survey like this, I take it one limitation you've implicitly identified is that they don't tell you everything about the experience of anti-Semitism.
Yeah. Like, surveys are very difficult to interpret. They may be easy to interpret in terms of significance. Significance in looking at surveys would be, has this variation happening by chance, or is there some significant element in that? And you determine significant in terms of the sample size and the subsample that you're looking at and so on. And is this different from that? Like, is the attitude to Christians different to attitudes to Jews at a significant level or not? Yeah. But the big problems with surveys is they are so dependent on the exact wording of the question. So you can get quite a whole range, if you're exploring one issue, from the wording of the question. So I'm never hung up on the wording of a particular question. What I'm looking for is the pattern, and the importance of trying to discern the sort of patterns. So in this discussion, there's quite considerable discussion of patterns. And we can look at that if you think appropriate later on. But that's the challenge of surveying. And order of questions can make a big difference. Like, if you have a particular question early in the survey, that may influence how people answer later in the survey and so on. So in this report, there are a number of examples of the problems that you can have in surveying, which I won't traverse until there's something of particular significance here. But I would just emphasise that what I am looking for in a survey is not the answer to a particular question, but it is the pattern of response, the probabilities. Does this go with that? Those sort of issues. What I like to say with surveying is that if what you're getting is noise, meaning when you disaggregate the findings, for example, by age group, and it's all over the place, there's no clear pattern. Like, I think there are patterns in societies, there's patterns in populations, and surveys help you understand that pattern. And when the survey is not working well, not always, but generally it may well be that there's something wrong here, something's happened. For example, if I may just go on very briefly, I've had the experience of doing probability-based surveys and non-probability-based surveys, and I've had the experience of being able to compare the two. And it really highlights the challenge of non-probability surveying, because you may not have a good sample.
I understand. Can I ask you about the design of the survey instrument? You personally designed it, is that right?
No, I did not.
All right.
So it depends on what we're talking about. If we're talking about the generalised anti-Semitism scale, I did not design that.
No, I'm not talking about the scale.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the series of questions that were put
Yeah.
in the survey. You
It's a very
designed which
small
questions
survey.
were asked.
Sorry?
You designed the content and form of the questions,
That is correct.
drawing upon the anti-Semitism subscale,
That is correct.
which was developed by others, that anti-Semitism
Yes, it was
scale.
developed by others.
And could you just describe for us what that generalised anti-Semitism scale is?
Yep. So that was developed by British academics, and they are academics who work in this field. They much more on the quantitative side of this discipline, whereas I'm much more on the humanist side. Like, my training is as a historian. I'm not a statistician. I work with statisticians, but I'm not a statistician. And I think I bring some value to surveying in that regard, because I'm looking for meaning in a sort of fundamental sense, rather than in a statistical sense. Now, just so that people understand how quality surveys are constructed, and we're talking about this scale, it's a very lengthy process. It could take 6 months or more. Like in the Social Research Centre, we were involved in redesigning our Index of Social Cohesion, and we probably spent at least 6 months on that. And what you would do is you would look at a number of questions that have been used in this field. There might be 50 questions. And you would refine those questions by a process known as factor analysis, and other processes as well.
You're now talking about the development of the anti-Semitism
Yep.
scale as
Yep.
opposed to this particular survey. I understand.
Yep. Yep. So just very briefly, so that it would be the statistics that would tell you that these questions go together. That question doesn't go together. So there might be a question which is an outlier, and it doesn't actually correlate with the other questions. That would be a basis for excluding that. And I won't go into the statistics, but there are obviously other ways, many other ways of testing the validity of a scale.
All right. There are two aspects to that anti-Semitism scale. One is called the Judeophobic anti-Semitism subscale, and as you describe it, paragraph 39, that's intended to capture what you call the old anti-Semitism. That is, it measures endorsement of traditional or classic prejudicial attitudes towards Jews as a group. Is that right?
That's right.
And it also comprises what's termed the anti-Zionist anti-Semitism subscale, which you describe as the new anti-Semitism, which seeks to measure endorsement of anti-Semitic attitudes directed at Israel and its supporters. Is that right?
That is correct.
Can I then ask you about the questions that were actually included in the survey that you designed, and they appear at Annexure 2 to your report from page 34.
Yes.
Am I right in thinking that question 2, which lists a series of statements 1 to 10, those are drawn from the Judeophobic subscale?
Not exactly, because there's 10 questions there, and 6 questions are in the actual scale. These other questions were derived largely from a Canadian survey conducted by Professor Robert Brim of the University of Toronto, and he used 10 questions, and we tried to add some other questions to see if that would improve the scale. And we've just been recently doing some work, not me, but a statistician colleague, and it didn't really, these additional questions did not improve the validity of the scale in a statistical sense. So that the report that I prepared uses the 6 questions that are in the subscale developed by the British academics.
And so if we want to understand what those 6 questions are, those are the questions set out in Table 2 of your report. Is that right?
Yes.
So that table lists the 6 questions from the Judeophobic subscale, correct?
I'm just trying to find it.
It's around about page 14.
Yeah, Table 2. Yes, that is correct.
I understand. And then question 4 in the survey instrument, which appears on page 35, that is, again, partly drawing from the anti-Zionist subscale.
It has the 6 items
Yes.
in the subscale plus the additional ones based on the Canadian research.
And so if we want to understand what were the questions from the anti-Zionist subscale, that's represented in Table 3
Yes.
on page 15 of your report. Is that right?
Correct.
And so did you find that the additional questions you included in the survey instrument were not valid in the same way you reached that conclusion for the additional questions for the first set of questions?
They were to some extent, but I did not think that they were necessary for this report. So I use a couple of those questions. For example, one of the questions was, Israel is an apartheid state.
That's a question that you added that wasn't from the anti-Zionist
That's
subscale?
correct. Yeah.
And so why did you add that question?
Just to test what impact that might have, what sort of response we would get. And what we found was with a very abstract question like that, the proportion of people giving don't know or prefer not to say, that sort of category of response went up. I think 60% or so, just from memory, but it's in here, with regard to that question. We can find it exactly, yes. This is Table 4, page 17. Israel is an apartheid state. 62% of people did not give a substantive response to that question. So to me what that says is that with regard to the general population, there's one group of people who are not interested, it's not their business, and there's another group who don't know. In a way, there's so much richness in this survey that I've got written here, 30 pages. We could easily write 130 pages on this. Because, for example, there are differences between men and women and how men and women answer a question about knowledge. But I thought for the purposes of this report, which is to give the broad lie of the land, it was not necessary to go into that detail.
All right, so if we then focus on the questions that are from the anti-Zionist subscale set out at Table 3 at page 15 of your report, can I just seek to understand the purpose behind some of these questions? So the first question that's listed there, I'm comfortable spending time with people who openly support Israel. People had the option of disagreeing, strongly agreeing, or strongly agreeing, or offering some more non-committal answers. Is that right?
That is right.
And so by including that question, say someone disagrees or strongly disagrees with that statement. In other words, they are saying they're not comfortable spending time with people who openly support Israel. Are you suggesting the person who answers that in that way is necessarily anti-Semitic?
Not at all. No.
Right. So what is the purpose of including that question then?
Well, you see, that mirrors the question in the Judeophobic scale. I'm just as open having Jewish friends. That was still on page 15. So that mirrors that. But at the end of the day, I just really make 2 points. I think it's a mistake to fixate on one question, because what we're looking at is the pattern of response. Because there may be the way that people interpret that question. The larger the sample and the more robust the scale, the more chance you've got of getting something meaningful. And see, what I would say that's meaningful there is it was 3% in general terms. It's gone up to 16%. So that might indicate like a 13% increase when we're asking that in the context of Israel. And it just points us in the direction, without being able to clearly establish the meaning at this stage, of the impact of those questions to do with Israel as opposed to questions in general terms.
So you're more interested in how people's responses to these questions change over time, and also how their responses to one question might line up with a response to another question,
Yes.
for example.
So you can see a clear pattern of the way that people are responding to that. So the strongest is when Israel treats the Palestinians like the Nazis treated the Jews. And you see, that's almost an outlier, isn't it? Because with other questions, 20% was the highest you got. There you got 33%. And the purpose of that is not to close the discussion, but to open the discussion. What does that mean? Yeah. And it doesn't mean if you endorse that you're anti-Semitic. I'm not really necessarily interested in that. I'm interested in the pattern of response and what happens to the pattern of response when you introduce Israel into the questions.
All right. We'll come to some more of your findings in more detail shortly to draw that out. But just for completeness, I'd ask you the same question in respect of the question you've included there. Israel and its supporters are a bad influence on our democracy. If someone agrees or strongly agrees with that statement, again, you're not suggesting that that's a necessarily anti-Semitic position.
Not at all. It's part of the matrix that we put together and try and get meaning out of that. And also I would add, that's my meaning. I always, because often when you get surveys reported, people don't give you the full frequencies. So you can see there's a lot of reports in my table. And when we release this, we also release the full questionnaire. With many other surveys, you get top-line findings. Here I'm presenting this data, and it's for us to think about. I think my aim is for the Commission to think about these issues. Is there substance? Are we learning anything from this? Or is this just, gobbledygook?
All right. So I take it then that to the extent anyone agrees with negative statements with Israel set out in this table, you're not suggesting they're necessarily being anti-Semitic?
Not at all.
Oh,
I
understand.
We do know what anti-Semitism means, and you last week, I think, were, I wouldn't say introduced to it because it's not something new, but you were certainly understood what anti-Semitism means in practice. This is not about anti-Semitism, this or that. It's about the pattern and how does society work. For example, how do young people answer those questions? How do people of a particular political persuasion answer that question? Are there patterns or not?
I understand. Can I ask you then about the method for conducting the survey, again, before coming to some of the particular findings? So the survey was conducted using the YouGov survey company, correct?
That is correct.
And they have a research panel comprising 71,000 individuals who've agreed to take part in surveys,
Yes,
correct?
that is correct.
But this particular survey, Crossroads 25, was completed by 2,270 respondents.
Yes.
And on your understanding, is the selection of those 2,270 out of the 71,000, that's not totally random selection, is it? Is it targeted in some way?
It's targeted in the sense that the survey company will set quotas. And when they reach those quotas, they will probably close off opportunities to do the survey. So a quota might be a particular age group. And there are 16 variables that they use and have provided for us. So they will set up certain quotas, and when they're filled, then the people who are responding don't have an opportunity to respond anymore.
And when you say quotas, so one is, for example, by age.
Yep.
What are the other sorts of quotas that are set on your understanding?
Well, an important quota would be the state in which they live. All right?
Yes.
So that has to mirror the whole population.
And so is the purpose of setting these quotas to ensure that the sample is representative of a cross-section of the Australian community?
That is correct, yes.
Right. And you mentioned that it included a sample boost of 800 people aged 18 to 30. What does that mean?
So from other surveys, we have established that young people are a particular interest in this space, in the way that they form their views on Israel, and so on. And if we had not provided a sample boost, the survey would have been not 2,200 plus, but 1,800. And we would have probably only have had like 400 young people. And you see, with any subset like that, once you disaggregate it, it becomes less and less reliable. So say you had 200 men, 220 women, 180 men, yeah? And then if I divide that into age groups again, you can see that the numbers get very small. And a lot of interest in the surveying is to understand subgroups. Because if you don't understand subgroups, the way I describe it, the results are flat. It doesn't have much predictive power. You don't know where this is going to go. So that's why, for example, young people are particularly interesting, because there is a difference with regard to age. Also, if you don't set up a good quota for young people, they're the hardest people to survey. Okay? You have to put a lot of effort into recruiting young people. So you're sort of understanding why we actually had decided to boost it to 800. So then we could get also not only reliable data for young people, but for subgroups within the young group. For example, are they currently at university? That might be of interest, etc. What's their level of qualifications? Have they got a job? Now, we haven't fully analysed all of those data, but that's the reason for having a boost.
Could I take you then to Table 2 on page 14, which sets out some of the finding or results of Crossroads 25 as compared to Crossroads 21, as compared to the survey conducted by the Special Envoy to Combat Antisemitism.
Yep.
For the statement, and just so I understand what's represented here, the first statement is Jewish people are just as loyal to Australia as other Australian people. You've indicated that 10% of those surveys either disagreed or strongly disagreed with that statement. Is that right?
Yes.
And for the next one, Jewish people can be trusted just as much as other Australian people in business. 8% disagreed or strongly disagreed with that statement.
Yes. Yep.
The next statement, I'm just as open to having Jewish friends as I am to having friends from other sections of the Australian society. 3% of those surveyed disagreed or strongly disagreed.
Yes, all of that is correct. Yep.
Jewish people talk about the Holocaust just to further their political agenda. 14% agreed or strongly agreed with that statement.
Yes, because you see the questions are reverse coded. So 3 are asked in a positive way and 3 are asked in a negative way.
Yes.
And also the surveys, the questions may be asked in different order. They can randomise the way so that you get a churn. You don't get everyone exactly applying the same way. The danger, if I can just add, the danger is if you're all asking in all negative or all positive, people just whiz through the survey and tick one box. But we could then tell they're called speeders, and the speeders would be excluded from the analysis.
And then for the next question, Australian Jewish people chase money more than other Australian people. 18% agreed or strongly agreed with that statement. Correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And the final one, compared to other groups, Jewish people have too much power in the media. 17% of those surveyed agreed or strongly agreed. Is that right?
Yes.
And the average across all those questions was 12% of those surveyed agreed with negative statements about Jewish people, in effect.
Yes, that's right.
All right. And then you've drawn a comparison to the results of the Special Envoy's survey and the Crossroads 21 survey. In your view, while there's some differences between them, do you consider the results of those other surveys consistent with your results or not?
I do, because the pattern is very similar. Like if you put in a gradation, the numbers are not identical, but the gradation is very similar. And what is interesting here is that these are surveys done by different companies. So the Crossroads YouGov, as we discussed, ASECA was Free Hills, using a different panel. And Crossroads 21, we actually used the probability panel from the Social Research Centre. So they're different methodologies or different sampling bases for those three. And yet the findings are similar. If you were to ask me why is 117 and why is 112, I couldn't answer that. Other than to say, the survey context is different, meaning the order of the questions might be different. And I actually happen to know that they were different. And they were done at different times. There might have been a different environment. But then when I look at that, in terms of my early categorisation, is it noise or is there substance? I would say that I can see a pattern there. And the pattern is consistent. And that gives me a bit more confidence that we basically used that scale on 3 different occasions and obtained quite a similar pattern. We keep coming back to this 15%. You see, if you average the 12 and 17, that's what you've got. So that sort of starts to form, not any individual question, but the pattern across the survey starts to form an understanding that in general terms, that's the proportion that we might be dealing with. But with some questions to do with Israel, you will get higher negativity, but not off the scale other than that one question about Gaza.
I'll come to
yes,
that shortly. I think you said that for the Special Envoys survey that was conducted by Free Hills. Did you mean to say Free Hills?
I think I did. Is that not correct?
Right. No, I'll have that checked. You may be right, but I'll come back to that.
Yeah. No, it's probably not. That's a legal firm, sorry.
Well, it is. So that's the basis for my question.
Yes.
But we can check that. Don't worry about that. Right. Now, some people may see that average of 12%, that is 12% who are agreeing with negative statements about Jews, and may say, well, that's not too bad. It's only a minority of people who hold these negative views. Can you draw that sort of conclusion from looking at that 12% figure?
No, because again, you're taking it in isolation. And what I'm interested in is the overall pattern in the population. Yeah. One of the strongest findings for me, which you won't find probably in any other surveys that I know of, is that I report on the people who don't know, don't care category. Very often in surveys, they just exclude it and the numbers are recalculated. I was surprised that even in the Pew survey, which is near the end of this report, they excluded the don't knows. I guess they exclude them because they don't have an opinion, and what we want is the opinions of people. But to me, that's an opinion. And if it's 45% of the Australian population, and that is accepted as probably valid, that could well be an important finding for the Commission going forward. I don't know, but I'm putting it out there that that's important.
And you've mentioned in your report that those sort of non-committal responses might be relevant if, for example, someone's designing an education program. It may be important to know that there's a large section of the community who just don't have a view on these things that may suggest a need for greater education in that area. Is that the sort of suggestion you're making?
And if you wanted to go down that line, you could conduct further analysis. because there's actually a difference between men and women in the proportion who say we don't know. And that's a very interesting further dimension, which I didn't have space to go into this report. Men are likely to have stronger views, and women will often be more diffident, although on humanitarian issues they could differ. So that's another dimension to be explored in this survey.
Could I then ask you about Table 3, and these are the questions drawn from the anti-Zionist subscale. The first question here is, I'm comfortable spending time with people who openly support Israel. 16% disagreed or strongly disagreed, in other words, indicating they'd be uncomfortable spending time with people who openly support Israel. Is that right?
Correct, yes.
And the second question, Israel has a right to exist as a homeland for the Jewish people. 6% disagreed or strongly disagreed, correct?
Correct.
Next question, Israel has a right to defend, or is right to defend itself against those who want to destroy it. 7% disagreed or strongly disagreed.
And what's interesting there is that those two questions, there are similar proportions. Question 4, the right to exist and right to defend itself is a similar proportion.
And why do you say that's interesting?
Because if I only had one question, I would be much less confident in its reliability. But if I've got two questions and I've got similar results, and when a second did it, and they also got similar results for those two questions, although marginally different, it gives me a bit more confidence in saying that is an interesting finding.
The next question was, Israel can get away with anything because its supporters control the media. 18% agreed or strongly agreed, correct?
Yes, and you see, if we go back to the previous scale, it was 17% on the media question. So again, that consistency. And you see, it's not like doing an exam and you can turn the page and see what you did before. It's in people's consciousness, even though it's in very different contexts. You're getting a similar finding. It's around 17, 18%. And that's what I mean about patterns.
Right. The next question, Israel and its supporters are a bad influence on our democracy. 20% agreed or strongly agreed.
Yes.
And the final question, Israel treats the Palestinians like the Nazis treated the Jews. 33% agreed or strongly agreed.
Yes.
And you regard that finding as significant, as you've set out in paragraph 48 of your report. Can you just explain to us why you consider that to be significant?
There's a bit of history to that, because when we first published the Crossroads 25 report, some people said to us, what's that question doing in there? Is that push polling? Are you putting ideas into people's minds? Yep. Because you don't want to be doing that in surveys. You actually want to get people's opinions rather than tell them what to think. So that was controversial. And that's why I comment here that that may be a fair proposition, but it's not one that I accept. Because people have the option of either agreeing, disagreeing, but also saying, I neither agree nor disagree, I don't know, or I prefer not to say. So people had that option. And the other thing you look for surveys is that a spurious option, because no one takes it? And again, in this survey, we can show that a lot of people are willing to take that non-committal position. So again, we have a non-committal substantive response. And that's why I think that question has validity, in addition to the fact that the statistical analysis, when we run factor analysis, tells us that fits in with the other questions. Because a factor analysis, if that was an aberrant question, if we think in terms of numbers, it would be like a 0.5, a 0.6, a 0.7 correlation, and that would be a 0.3, and it would stand out, as it doesn't belong there. But in fact, when we do that analysis, and there's some of that in this report, it shows it does belong.
You've also noted in paragraph 48 that the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism states that drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis may be anti-Semitic depending on the context.
Yes.
So I take it you accept that whether or not such a statement is anti-Semitic does depend on the context.
Totally depends on the context.
Right. In Table 4, you've set out the range of non-committal law, don't know responses, and I think you've already explained why you consider those to be significant. So what I might do then is continue on to that part of your report which identifies results by population segment, which starts from paragraph 57. You observed, did you, that there's a higher proportion of agreement with some negative statements about Jews or Israel in some population segments?
That is correct, yes.
And they included younger respondents from the age of 18 to 34, is that right?
That is correct, yep. Yes.
As well as current university students and graduates?
Yes, it's not in the table, but it's in the discussion.
I understand. And as well as what you've described as supporters of left-wing causes, there was a higher proportion of agreement with negative statements about Jews or Israel in that category of persons as well?
Yes.
And is it possible those three categories overlap, i.e. they're not mutually exclusive?
Correct, yes.
And can I ask, how did you ascertain supporters of left-wing causes as you describe it? How did you go about ascertaining a respondent's political alignment in that way?
Well, I think it's generally understood that the Greens Party would be left of centre in this country. So in that context, that's there. But I also have in my head understanding of a lot of other surveying. So later on we might look at the Pew surveys, and the Pew surveys find that they actually use, are you right, centre or left? We don't have those terminologies in Australia. We don't use them much in surveys because I think they're much better understood in America than here. But when they use that left category, they got a really high response for Australia.
Right, but you don't use that category, as you said, in the
No.
Crossroads 25 survey, but you were able to ascertain the respondents' political alignment, you say, by virtue of having information about how they voted in the last federal election?
Yes.
That's how you went about ascertaining political alignment?
And there's other indicators as well in our survey data, because YouGov also provided for us how people voted at the voice referendum and what their attitudes are today. But I think clearest is how they voted in 2025. The survey was in 2025.
Yeah. And is understanding how someone votes in the last federal election a reliable indicator of their political alignment in circumstances where they may change their vote election to election?
Sure, it's never going to be a totally reliable, but the question is there a pattern? And if we look at Table 5, you can see a very clear pattern. It's interesting, isn't it, that
let's go
the
to Table
Greens
5. Yep.
Are scoring lowest on the Judeo-phobic scale, highest on the anti-Zionist subscale. And you can see that the Labor is similar to that but not identical, and Coalition One Nation a bit different. So the patterns there, I think, are very telling. And to me what they would say is the Greens, in general terms, are human rights advocates. Not in general terms, I think in a fundamental sense they are. And they're against discrimination and the great supporters of various causes. So it's interesting that they score very low on that Judeo-phobic scale.
So just
but
to
obviously they have attitudes with regard to Israel.
Right. So in Table 5, on the Judeophobic subscale, what you've indicated there is that of those who voted Green in the last federal election, 8% of those people, insofar as they responded to this survey, agreed with negative views on that Judeophobic scale. Is that what you're saying there? That's the average across all
six
questions. I understand. But then when it comes to those 6 questions on the anti-Zionist subscale, what you're recording there is that 30% of respondents who voted Green in the last election agreed with the negative statements about Israel on that scale. Is that right? Okay. And then you've set out for the figures for Labor, Independent Coalition and One Nation as well. But it's the Greens that had the highest percentage of any of those political parties or persuasions that had the highest percentage of agreement with negative views on that anti-Zionist subscale. Is that right?
Which does not mean that they're anti-Semitic. It's on that scale, that is the score that they obtain on average.
Yes, I think I understand now. You're not suggesting that 30% of Greens voters are anti-Semitic.
No.
Thank you for that clarification. Then in Table 6, you set out some of your results by reference to age group as well. So what you're recording there is that taking that question of Israel has a right to exist as a homeland for the Jewish people, the national average was 6% of disagreement, but for the category 18 to 24-year-olds, there was 15% disagreement. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And taking the question, Israel is right to defend itself against those who want to destroy it, 7% of the national sample disagreed, whereas 22% of those aged 18 to 24 disagreed. Is that right?
That is correct.
And then for the statement, Israel treats the Palestinians like the Nazis treated the Jews, of the national sample, 33% agreed with that statement, whereas 54% of 18 to 24-year-olds agreed with that statement.
Yep, that is correct.
All right. And do you regard that as a significant finding?
I do. Because with a lot of, across the general population, the highest negative we got was 33% for one question. And for any other question, it was around 20%. Yep. So to get it up to now 54% from 33 to 54, that is a very strong finding. It means that, half the people within that cohort, or more than half the people, do agree with that statement. And again, it doesn't mean they're anti-Semitic. It means there's a question. What is going on there? And the answer might well be the humanitarian people and their concern, etc., which is not going down the path of labelling them as anti-Semitic.
Can I ask you then about Table 7? And one question that was included in the survey was, it's been reported that Hamas killed around 1,200 Israelis in the attacks on 7th October 2023. From what you've seen or heard, do you think these reports are, 1, broadly true, and 48% agreed with that they're broadly true? Is that right?
Yes.
And then another option that you offered was broadly untrue, and 5% of those surveys said that that report, that is of Hamas killing around 1,200 Israelis on 7 October, 5% said that was broadly untrue.
Correct.
3% said prefer not to say, and 44% said not sure.
Yes, that's correct.
But you note that the percentages differ in respect of some population segments. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
So it was a substantially higher proportion of people saying it was untrue in the group aged 18 to 24. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
What was the proportion?
I think it might have been 12%, yes?
12%. I'm just trying to lay my eyes on it. Yes. In paragraph 70,
Yes.
you say for those aged 18 to 24 and the slightly older Gen Z age group up to age 28 in 2025 and the overlapping grouping of current university students, 12 to 13% of respondents in each of those categories answered that the report of casualties was broadly untrue.
Yep.
Is that right?
And for me, that's a very important question, a very important finding.
And why is that?
Well, for one thing, 44% say we're not sure. Now that is consistent, isn't it, with that around 45% of the population who aren't well informed, don't know, don't care, that sort of group. But it is this an opinion or is it a statement of fact that this happened? Mm-hmm. Now, if you were to ask various segments of the population, such as the Jewish community, is it true or not true? I would be surprised if it fell much below 90% of people saying it's true. Yeah. But in the general population, you've got 44% of people saying we're not sure, which is, and I think you've heard testimony, that is a fundamental watershed in the Jewish community's life in this country and internationally. And here, when we're asking the general population, what we're finding is that 44% of people are not sure, but more than that, 5% outright say it's probably not true. And then later on I do correlations and the significance is exemplified.
Let's go to those correlations that you describe. Are they set out in tables 8.1 to 8.3 of your report? Oh, and on to 8.5 on the next page?
Yep.
All right, so in table 8.1, here you're trying to correlate people's responses to that previous question we just looked at, reports of 1,200 casualties, with their responses to other questions from both the Judeophobic and anti-Zionist subscale. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
So in table 8.1, you're indicating that of those who agreed or strongly agreed with the statement, Jewish people talk about the Holocaust just to further their political agenda, 14% of those people are saying the reports of 1,200 casualties was true, whereas 43% are saying it's untrue. Is that right?
So it's willingness to agree with the proposition that Jews talk about the Holocaust for political agenda. It's part of their agenda. That's what they're doing. Yep.
Yes.
And if you had said that it was broadly untrue, that it was broadly true, that this incident happened on the 7th of October, not really an incident, 14% of those, but more than, let's say 3 times that proportion of the people who responded broadly untrue agree with that statement. So you see, the question is, how do we get from this data to anti-Semitism? And I haven't really got there in this report, because what I'm particularly wanting to do is to look at the lie of the land. But how is it possible that a person, one, let's say is a university student, denies the reality of what happened on the 7th of October, and also says, or 43% of them also say, that the Holocaust is part of the political agenda. And we can take some other things, like Jews are largely to blame for the economic troubles of the world. That's the next one. Now that's a basic anti-Semitic trope. Jews start the wars, Jews do this, Jews do that. Yes. Not so many in the broadly untrue are getting to that position, but about a quarter are.
That's 28.
That's the 28%. So amongst those who said that was untrue, broadly untrue, and they also, a quarter of them, that group, also agree that Jews are largely to blame for blah, blah. Yep. And that's how I think we can join things together. Like Jews control the media. On that one, it's gone up to 64%. So it's following the trail, following the correlations where we make sense of this, not in individual questions, but in patterns. You see, another pattern there which might validate this is if we say that people who are not sure, but the people who are not sure what happened on that day are also not sure or neither agree or disagree in disproportionate numbers. You see in Table 8.1 is 29 plus 19 plus 1, compared to 6% who said it was broadly true. Does that make sense?
Yes.
That it's the consistency you get across a survey by looking at a range of questions.
And so, as you suggested earlier, one way a policymaker might use this information is to say, well, if they're agreeing with this statement as well as that statement, that might show a lack of education in a certain area, and we need to design a response to that.
Not necessarily lack of education. It's more a mindset that you have reports from the United Nations on sexual violence that was committed. Now, who would have most access to that sort of information? Would it be university students, more so than other sections of the community? And yet, if we run some of these correlations, we find they deny this and they agree with that. Yeah? And so you have an issue there. And I don't for a second think that if we educate people, you're going to get around that. Because some of them will say they're not sure because they basically don't follow the news. But there might be others in other categories for adopting that position.
But is that significant in this sense?
Yes.
That the question of whether the number of people killed in the Hamas attack on Israel is broadly true is a question of fact.
Yes.
Whereas the other questions that are the subject of comparison are questions about attitudes.
But you see, I don't simply see that as a question of fact. I believe what I want to believe rather than a simple statement of fact.
The reason I'm asking, Professor, is my age group reads what is now described as the legacy media.
Yes.
I understand people under a certain age wouldn't know what that is.
Yeah.
So the 44 who are not sure might well be people who are truthfully responding that they simply haven't seen reports.
Exactly. And so we're not... The point I'm drawing from that is if they're not sure about that, it's interesting they're also not sure about a whole range of other issues as well.
Yes.
And there's a pattern there that says that they're disproportionately unsure about a whole range of things.
But there's not a difference in your view between lack of sureness about a fact and lack of sureness about a broader attitude to a subject.
Yeah, it's the broader attitude of the subject. And particularly that 5% who say broadly untrue.
Yeah.
Because you might say 5%, give or take, that's nothing. But when we look at some subgroups, it's 12 or 13%, which starts to become one person in 8. And then it may well be interesting. And then you look at these correlations and you say, yes, we may have something there.
Yes.
And we would sit around the table and other people would say, no, you don't have that. But it's a basis for getting into people's minds and people's attitudes.
Yes, sorry, Ms Hager.
And so is it fair to say that that question about October 7 is really testing respondents' beliefs about those events rather than
No, I wouldn't
testing.
say just beliefs,
Right.
but it's a mixture. It's being informed, but also perhaps being in a position of denial.
I understand. Commissioner, I know at the time I anticipate I'll be maybe another 10 minutes or so as
Well,
part
I think
of
it
my
might be time for the
examination.
morning adjournment then, Ms Hager. The Commission will adjourn for 15 minutes.
Earlier, can you just explain to us what the results of that survey were and whether you consider them to be consistent or not with your own results?
Good. So it's about people's views about Israel. And they asked, are you favourable or unfavourable? And then they had a subset like very unfavourable or somewhat unfavourable. And I've been reflecting on that question since I wrote this. And it is a very general question, isn't it? Because how is it that they got, for Australia, 74% unfavourable? And I think it has something to do with the question that they ask, favourable, unfavourable. It doesn't have much nuance in it or substance in it. But the value of it is that they ask the same question in 24 countries. And the big finding there, I think, is that Australia is in the top group of countries with unfavourable views. And if we just look at English-speaking countries, Australia is the largest proportion with unfavourable views.
So if we look at table 11 on page 27, Australia has 74%, the UK has 61%, Canada 60%, and the USA 53%. Is
Yes.
that right? And that percentage of people either said unfavourable or very unfavourable views of Israel. Is that right?
Yes, correct. And even if we just look at very unfavourable, Australia's 39%, which is the highest proportion. So I think for me, the way I interpret that is the value is the ranking of the countries and where Australia is ranked, rather than the general question that they asked.
Right. So do you see that as consistent with your findings or not?
I think it's a challenge. I see it as a challenge. And I see that as something to be thought through. And also, if we could look at the figure 5, which I referred to earlier, left, centre or right. They use those terms. And where they're only reporting the countries where they've got significant differences. And Australia has the largest gap between left and right. And left is 90%. So again, in terms of understanding the landscape in Australia, it fits in with my understanding that, say, the settler colonial narrative, and that's what I link this to, but that's just my interpretation, has particular purchase in Australia, given the salience of Indigenous issues in this country and so on. I don't know, but that could be one possible explanation for why that very sharp left-right division, and also that Australia is at the highest level.
But that sort of narrative might also be in play in the US and in Canada, for example, would it not? That settler colonial narrative you describe.
I would think that in America it has less salience. Possibly in Canada, but in Australia has less salience. And that's speculative, obviously.
I understand.
the Pew survey of which we are speaking
Yes.
Was conducted in March of 2025, is that right?
Yes. And it had a large Australian sample, 1,800, and used a probability sample. So in terms of methodology and rigour, the Pew Research Agency, I think, is almost the gold standard as far as I'm concerned. But I mean, it's an interesting question if they chose to ask such a general question.
Mm.
You conclude your report on page 30 by saying that your report has sought to understand attitudes and their distribution, but for a fuller understanding, focus is required on activism, that is, on those who are driven to act, the specifics of motivation and strategies. Can you just elaborate on what you mean by that?
So I see the value of this at three levels. One is an overview of society and the relative proportions, the relative distribution of attitudes, and for us to work towards a fuller understanding of that. I don't say that I've got it here, but I've got elements of that, and it's an important conversation to have. It's important in terms of any programs that might be developed in this space. Yeah. The second point is that it makes sense in terms of segments, because I think that if we look at the overall view of a society, it's probably lacking explanatory power. Whereas if you look at subgroups and you look at how the subgroups play out, you start to get a better sense of where this society might be heading. For example, young people, who are the leaders of tomorrow. Yep. That gives you a sense of where this society might be going. And the third point I make is that this attitudinal survey doesn't actually tell you about anti-Semitism occurring in Australia at a particular time, because it's in a way, if you had 2,000 people in this country who were minded to act aggressively with regard to Jewish people, that could have a tremendous impact on the community. Whereas if you're talking about 10% of the population or 20%, in Australia, the population over the age of 18 is 22.2 million. Yeah. So if we had 10% of those, well, that would be so grossly overrepresented in terms of trying to understand what's happening in terms of actions. But you don't get actions at that scale. It's those particular people who are minded to act. And they're a fundamental element of the equation. And if all you looked at was attitudinal surveys, you would not capture that.
And so am I understanding you correctly to say that just because someone might have an attitude that is described as negative towards Jews or negative towards Israel, that doesn't necessarily indicate that they're willing to act on those views by perpetrating anti-Semitic acts, and so that's a separate discussion.
It's another dimension. I think if we're thinking of it in terms of dimensions, actions is one dimension, attitudes is another. There can be obviously links, yeah, but you won't understand that activist group and what proportion they make of a society by just looking at general surveys.
I understand. I have no further questions.
Yes. Before I turn to Ms. Dwyer, I should say Mr. Kaplan and Ms. Boyle.
Who's not
I'm
present
sorry, I thought.
here.
She's absent on the screen. Commissioner Gardner is playing.
Yes, Mr. Gardner. My understanding is that neither the Commonwealth nor New South Wales evinced an interest in the examination of witnesses in this hearing block. That's the reason I didn't turn to you earlier.
That is my understanding.
Yes, very well. Ms. Dwyer, I should say I appreciate your what I would describe as modest estimate for the amount of time your examination might take. I'm not going to hold you to 15 minutes, but I ask you to be reasonable, and I'll indicate if I think it's gone beyond that.
Commissioner, we're very grateful for that, but in fact most of our questions have been covered, so I might in fact give you a pleasant surprise and be less.
Even more splendid, thank you.
We've got two broad categories. Professor Markus, I'm going to ask you to return very briefly to paragraph 65 of your report for the Commission, where there's the table in table 5 that you've already helpfully given some evidence about. Before I do, I just wanted to clarify, if I may, these subcategories. For the Crossroads 25 survey, you distinguish between what's been referred to as old anti-Semitism or Judeophobia and new anti-Semitism, which is sometimes called anti-Zionist anti-Semitism. Am I correct?
But they are part of the one scale. And the statistics in this report show that when you do the various analyses like Cronbach's alpha and so on, they are found to be part of the one scale.
Okay, just in relation to table 5, for example, though, you think it's worthwhile to draw out the differences between Judeophobic subscale and anti-Zionist subscale. Do you see that?
That is correct.
And what you've been at pains to say that it's certainly possible to be critical of Israel and not be anti-Semitic. You've said that. But in terms of classical anti-Semitic stereotypes or Judeophobia, it's very obvious, isn't it, that it's hard to imagine that you could be Judeophobic without being anti-Semitic. Sorry?
Yeah, I think that's correct. Okay. That is correct.
And if you have a look then at paragraph 65, you've made it clear that by far the highest percentage of voters expressing classically anti-Semitic Judeophobic views are One Nation voters, correct?
They're not huge differences in numbers, but they are differences in numbers.
Well, 17% of One Nation voters express those.
And 13% Labor. Views. So it's a difference of 4 percentage points in a survey in which the margin of error would be around 3%. So, and this is a subgroup within that. So you can't definitively say that One Nation is, that far different.
But you can definitively say that 17% of those responses were Judeophobic, is that right?
Yes. On that scale, yes. Subscale.
And what the lowest percentage of Judeophobic responses came from the Greens? You
Correct.
See that? And what your report shows there is that it's certainly possible to hold anti-Zionist views without holding Judeophobic views.
That is right.
Just the second and last topic relates to the findings from the Scanlon Foundation survey mapping report, which you helpfully pull out. That's at page, or you refer to them at page 8 of your report. And you've given evidence this morning about some of the significant findings. Just a reminder, to put it in context, that the Scanlon Foundation survey mapping social cohesion looked at the attitudes to 6 faith groups: Buddhists, Christians, Hindus, Jews, Muslims and Sikhs. And you gave evidence this morning that one important finding is that the negative attitude expressed towards people of Jewish faith has increased since 2023, up 6% from 9% to 15%. You recall
Correct, that is correct.
And your evidence was that's in a very important context, because you've got those findings expressed over a period of time.
Yes.
Am I right that in fact the greatest negative increase from 2023 to 2025 was in fact towards Muslim groups, up 8 points from 27 to 35?
So you're drawing a distinction between 6 points
No. I'm just if you could focus on that question first. Am I right that that's the greatest increase in
But
terms
I
of the
can't
negative
answer
attitudes?
that without explaining that with the margin of error, just looking at the numbers, that is the largest increase.
Okay.
Yes. But in terms of significance, and is that a reliable difference? I would say no, because the margins of difference are so small.
You might be anticipating the wrong question that's coming next, which is you've given evidence that it's important to look at that increase in negative attitudes towards Jewish people from 9% to 15%. Equally, it's important, isn't it?
No, I'm not sure that I did actually say that.
I think the evidence you gave was that it's very important context to look at the fact that the negative attitude towards people of Jewish faith has increased since 2023, up 6 percent points.
I think my point was that it has increased basically for all groups.
Okay.
I can't simply distinguish the Jewish increase from the other groups. And the point I was wanting to make is that if all the data that you had was for one group, whether it was for Jewish or others, you would get a different understanding than if you had the overall perspective as you have here.
Right, and figure 2 is helpful, isn't it, in giving you an overall perspective in relation to those 6 faith groups?
That is correct.
And what it shows is that there has been a significant increase in the negative attitudes towards the Muslim population.
That is correct.
Are you aware, given your interest and expertise in social cohesion, of any reports that show people who hold racist views towards one group tend to hold racist groups towards other groups?
It's not part of my work, but I'm sure that if we had some psychiatrists here and so on who would know how the attitudes are correlated, but I personally can't talk to that.
Do you accept that might, I'm just drawing on your general expertise, that might be an interesting thing to know in terms of understanding social cohesion and how we foster it?
Definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dwyer. Ms. Gilman?
Commissioner, just 2 questions, if I may.
Yes.
Professor Markus, you gave some evidence this morning that you see your work as complementary to the evidence that the Commission has been hearing about Jewish lived experience. Do you recall saying that this
Yes,
morning?
I do.
And I take it that you don't see your work as contradicting in any way the evidence of lived experience.
Not at all.
May I ask you if you could just elaborate for the Commission on the way in which you see your work as complementary to the lived experience evidence?
Yep. I think my way of answering that is if you had one without the other, what would you have? So if all that you had was lived experience, some of it would speak to broader issues because people would say, in my suburb, rather than just in my, or they would say, in my university. So some of that qualitative work, and I've done quite a lot of qualitative work, goes beyond the individual to generalizable, particularly if you had like 10 people from a one environment and they were telling you about this is what's happening in that environment. But that essentially is about the tangible reality. And what the direction of yield of this work, the direction of gain of this work, is that it gives you that overview. So you have this proportion in that category, that proportion, and that proportion. I think I've said that one of the important findings is the middle category, that maybe 45% of people would have no firm views one way or another. Now, I don't think you would ever get that from lived experience. So you need really both. But we would be seriously impoverished if all we had was survey data. And in the Scanlon Foundation work now in the last few years, in addition to the survey data, we've actually had a section of interviewing with people so they can tell us what actually is going on the ground.
Thank you, Professor. Nothing further, Commissioner.
Yes, thank you. Anything arising out of that?
No, Commissioner.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Professor. Your